Senator McPhedran.
Thank you very much, Your Honour. I want to acknowledge that I come from Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory, and it is the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. Je tiens à souligner que le Parlement du Canada
Parliament of Canada is located on the Algonquin-Anishinaabe territory, which is unceded and unconstituted.
Bringing this bill to the Senate of Canada. Bill S-274 honors the life and legacy of Thanadelthur, and as the ambassador of peace in the early 18th century. Thanadelthur was a young Indigenous woman of strength, resilience, and fierce determination to protect her people. Records from the time speak of her as a skilled guide, peacemaker, interpreter, and negotiator who played a crucial role in the expansion of the fur trade in the early 1700s. More important, at a time when Dene and Cree were traditional enemies, Thanadelthur was the indispensable key to forging a peace between the two nations. Her remarkable story allows us to reflect both on the extraordinary impact she has had in shaping our shared history as a nation, and lamentably on the many ways in which Indigenous stories, cultural practices, and contributions have been ignored for far too long. By supporting this bill, we are sending a strong message and affirming our commitment that these Indigenous stories will no longer be forgotten. This story takes place before Canada became a nation, before Manitoba existed. Born in the late 17th century, Thanadelthur was a member of the Dene Nation, a group indigenous to the subarctic region of what is now known as Nunavut and northern Manitoba. Little is known about her early years, but in 1713, while on a caribou hunting expedition with her family, she was captured by the Cree, a rival Indigenous group to the Dene. Thanadelthur managed to escape after a year of captivity, and after a harrowing journey that left her near death, she finally reached Fort York, now called York Factory, which was an early Hudson's Bay Company trading post. Thanadelthur's great work came about in 1715 when she was employed as the guide, interpreter, and negotiator for the Hudson's Bay Company in their efforts to establish peaceful relations between the Cree and Dene. Her Dene, Cree, and English trilingualism, her tenacity and perseverance, and her skill as a negotiator led to a historic peace agreement between two traditionally warring peoples. I mark the wisdom, humility, and the depth of character it must have required of her to forego any feelings of revenge or hostility towards those who were her traditional enemies and her captors, and instead chose to forge a path to peace. The Bay records from that period make it clear that peace would have been unattainable without her pivotal role. In June 1715, a delegation of 150 people set out from Fort York on a peace mission and traveled some 1,000 kilometers in 8 months, pushing through an Arctic winter. It was Thanadelthur's guidance and determination that kept the delegates from turning back. It was her skill and knowledge that kept them from perishing in the wild. And ultimately, it was her fortitude that saw the final peace accord struck and honored. To quote from a record of that period, "She made them all stand in fear of her. She scolded at some and forced them to peace. Her voice was hoarse from persuading her people." Sadly, she succumbed to illness less than 2 years later and died on February 5, 1717, buried at Fort York. Hers is a story that still resonates within Cree and Dene communities in their oral history to this day. Examining her story from a distance of over 300 years, we can learn modern lessons. Thanadelthur is but an early example of the tireless leadership and resolute quality of Indigenous women who both nurture as mothers and protect as warriors. I think of contemporary Thanadelthurs who, despite obstacles, hardship, and opposition, are similarly leading restorative peace and reconciliation efforts in our own time, such as Indigenous activists like the late Mary Tuax Early, Cindy Blackstock, Pam Pomander, Autumn Peltier, Diane Redsky, and our former colleague senators, the Honourable Sandra Lovelace-Nicholas and the Honourable Lillian Dick. I think of Inuit leader Rosemary Kuptana, artist Daphne Ojic, Manitoba's own Jackie Travers, and my family's beloved friend, legendary filmmaker Aleni Sobomsawin, now 92 and working on her 54th film. And in this place, we are blessed with Indigenous women leaders who were all esteemed trailblazers before agreeing to be named to this chamber. Indigenous women and girls play a key role in preserving their communities. They often act as agents of peace, leading movements that eventually bring the warring parties to the negotiation table. These strong, clear Indigenous women leaders are often the first to speak truth to power, including within their own communities, to address the root causes of a conflict and increase community engagement. When I was home in Winnipeg this weekend, I met with 3 of Winnipeg's most effective leaders, Hilda Anderson-Pierce, Sandra Delarande, and Keely Tenfingers, to debrief on their recent trip to United Nations headquarters in Geneva to contribute to the review of Canada under CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, as members of the largest delegation of Indigenous women ever to attend such a CEDAW review. Before coming to this chamber, I was a professor who, with a team of students in our human rights program at the University of Winnipeg Global College, ensured that Canada's first National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security noted the importance of domestic peace building and Indigenous women's leadership. International studies have conclusively shown that women's participation in peace agreements leads to better and more sustainable outcomes with higher rates of implementation. Honoring this historic and heroic peace builder, Thanadelthur, through passage of this bill also honors Indigenous women as leaders. As an example of some progress, I am pleased to read to you from Canada's recently released 3rd National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. The action plan also recognizes that the Government of Canada is implementing the WPS agenda through a range of efforts aimed at addressing gender-based discrimination, violence, oppression, and marginalization faced by women and gender-diverse people in Canada, particularly Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. It acknowledges the intersecting discrimination and violence based on gender, Indigenous identity, socioeconomic status, and other identity factors, as well as underlying historic causes, in particular, the legacy of colonialism and the devastation caused by the residential school system. It also acknowledges that leadership by Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender-diverse people is essential to achieving sustainable peace and security for all. The second lesson I draw from her story is more somber because Thanadelthur is also a symbol of unknown, effaced, and obscured Indigenous voices, stories sadly forgotten or deliberately erased, if not for the oral traditions that keep their small lights burning. She speaks to our ongoing tragedy of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, to colonial repression, to racism, sexism, and all other forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls. Research shows Indigenous women are 400% more likely than other Canadians to go missing. The problem is so pervasive that the Canadian government does not know how many Indigenous women are missing or have been murdered. Ironically, these women are over-policed but under-protected. Estimates suggest that around 4,000 Indigenous women have been lost. Thanadelthur's own grave is lost. Estimates that, like this, point to the reality, for example, of the bodies of Morgan Harris and Mercedes Miran, believed to be buried in a Winnipeg landfill, still waiting to be recovered. In the case of Thanadelthur's grave, the land of the original Fort York has eroded and washed out to sea. Without a monument to mark her resting place, a beautiful tradition has developed in northern Manitoba. Every February 5th, to mark the date of her passing, people lay red roses into the waters of the Hudson's Bay. Senator McCollum, in speaking to her bill, brought another modern dimension to this historic tale, as she shared aspects of her own Cree upbringing in Manitoba and the ongoing joining of Cree and Dene communities across boundary lines, family ties, and generations of hostility. History is a living, growing thing, and when history is herstory, wisdom transcends time. To conclude, the Thanadelthur's contributions provide a powerful example of the importance of commemorating Indigenous histories as called for in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Call to Action 79 to the federal government to, quote, develop a reconciliation framework for Canadian heritage and commemoration. This would include the contributions of Aboriginal peoples to Canada's history, end of quote. Further, Bill S-274 moves Canada a step towards actualizing our commitments under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, specifically Article 15 of Canada's UNDRIP Act provides to Indigenous people the right to, quote, dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information, end of quote. I commend Senator McCollum for introducing S-274, an act to establish a National Thanadelthur Day. This bill is an excellent starting point in giving equal place to Indigenous stories. The story itself is about a peacemaker who brought about harmony in conflict that strengthened the foundations for a Canada to be. By commemorating Thanadelthur's achievements, not only will we fulfill commitments under the TRC Calls to Action and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Canada's same act, but also ensure that Indigenous contributions are a visible and celebrated part of our shared heritage. Let us move this bill to committee. Therefore, Speaker, I call question on this bill.